And I want to give my thanks to Mike Bettini, not only for inviting me to talk, but for the initial idea of this book in the first place. He got the idea for the book. He wanted a co-author, and originally we were going to do this together, and then Mike got so busy doing other things that were paying him better than this book would ever pay him, and eventually had to drop out. And so I found another co-author. The reason why I felt I needed a co-author was this is the first book that I ever wrote. I had been writing a whole career full of writing technical scientific papers, but this was a book for the general public, and it's a very different style of writing. And this was my first attempt at doing that, and with a co-author, that helped a lot. And since then, I've written a few other books by myself. I learned how to do it. Okay, going on to salt marshes. What is a salt marsh? A salt marsh is a wetland that surrounds an estuary. And then we can say, well, what's an estuary? I guess most of you know, but it's an area where fresh water and salt water mix. And a couple of pictures, you see sinuous channels here, tidal creeks, and here's the marsh. Here's a close-up view. Some plants right at the water's edge, other plants further behind. Well, okay. One thing you always see in a salt marsh is a distinct zonation of plants, and I'll get to that in a minute. The low marsh is flooded twice a day at high tide, and it's dominated here on the East Coast by one particular species, the smooth cordgrass or Spartina alterniflora, and that's the grass right here at the edge. Looking at the zonation in this picture, here is the marsh edge, the water being here, and you have the Spartina cordgrass zone here, and then you go further back and you get a group of other plants that are called the high marsh. Generally, the middle part has Spartina patens. This is the one that falls down, and you see this plant lying on the floor of the marsh. And then further back, you get the black rush, the marsh elder, the salicornia, the saltwort, which is a succulent plant. So these are typical sorts of plants you see in the salt marsh. A plant living in a salt marsh has to deal with some unique problems that a typical grass, typical plant would not have to deal with. One is that it's going to be living in salt water. Now, if you were to put salt water on the grass in your lawn, your grass would not be very happy and probably would not survive very long. So these plants have to deal not only with being submerged in water twice a day, but they also have to deal with the salt, with the salinity. And the cordgrass has special adaptations to do this. I'll get to that in a second. And the other issue is that they're underwater in areas where their roots have very low oxygen. So we have a few unique problems that happen to you if you're a plant living in salt water. The cordgrass, which is the Spartina, that's the one that gets immersed the most, has salt glands. And actually, you can see these little pieces, they're grains of salt, that the plant excretes the salt through pores in its leaves. So that's a special adaptation to dealing with salt. It also has special tissues that transport oxygen down below ground to the roots so that there can be oxygen for the roots. Okay, here's a look at some of the plants further back in the salt marsh. The salt haze is the one lying down. Here's your succulent saltwort salicornia, seaside lavender, marsh elder, groundsel. These are much more typical in the high marsh. The high marsh plants are not generally immersed in water, but they do have their roots in salty soil. Okay, what kind of things does a salt marsh do? What's it all about? Well, it is a breeding ground or nursery area for many species of fish, for shrimp, for crabs, and for birds. It is a stopping off place for many migratory birds. It is habitat for mammals like raccoons and muskrats. And very importantly, a salt marsh has very high productivity. It supports a huge amount of life. Generally, if you're trying to think about a kind of environment with very high productivity, you may think of coral reefs, you may think of rainforests, and indeed those are very highly productive systems, but so are salt marshes. Another thing salt marshes do is they can help people in terms of flood control and storm surge reduction. So when people living near the coast, vulnerable to hurricanes and other kinds of storms, a salt marsh can be a buffer. It also acts as a filtration. It purifies the water. When water is running through the marsh on the way into the estuary, the salt marsh can pick up impurities, contaminants, excess nutrients, and so forth. A little bit about marshes as a buffer. This becomes important in the age of Sandy and these various other coastal hurricanes and storms that have caused a great deal of damage. Marshes are a line of defense that will help not only protect to some degree against winds and storm surge, but also serve to store some of the water and attenuate the waves. Diminish wind penetration and wave strength. Marshes have to maintain their elevation by adding new sediments. And we will talk about this a little more later on. The damage in an area is inversely proportional to the amount of wetlands. It was seen very clearly when there was a tsunami in the Pacific that areas that had their mangroves are a tropical equivalent of salt marshes. It's vegetation growing at the edge of the water. The areas where the mangroves had been chopped down were damaged a whole lot more than the areas where the mangroves had been maintained. Coastal wetlands also help to stabilize shorelines, prevent erosion, and improve water quality. So they do a whole lot of good things for us, as well as good things for the residents in the water, like the fishes and crabs. Okay, talking about the productivity. As I said, it has very high productivity, comparable to a rainforest. However, there are very few grazing animals. When you think of an area with high productivity, you'll expect zebras or some large herbivores chomping on the leaves. There generally is not that kind of animals on rainforest, on salt marshes, but there are animals that will eat the grass after it has died and is decaying. So what happens is that in the fall, the plant dies, the leaves fall onto the marsh surface, and bacteria and fungi work on them, decaying them. And that turns into detritus. Detritus is basically decaying plant material plus the microbes that are decaying it. And so here's, there's detritus. It's not the prettiest thing, but just like in vernal pools, which we heard about this morning, where the decaying leaves are the beginning of the food chain, that's true in salt marsh also. So we have the detritus. We have a whole bunch of critters that are called detritus feeders. These are worms, clams, crabs, etc., that are then in turn eaten by larger animals and so forth. So this productivity gets up through the food chain. Some important marsh animals We have extremely important in marshes, the ribbed mussel. This is a relative of the blue mussel that Chris showed you pictures of. These are typical in salt marshes, but like the blue mussels, they put out these elastic byssus threads that attach them into sediment particles, help bind the sediments together, and may attach also to the roots of the marsh grasses. So the wastes from the mussels are then, the nitrogenous wastes by the mussels are then incorporated into the plants. So we have a beneficial relationship here between the mussels and the marsh grasses. Some other important animals in marshes are fiddler crabs, and I'm showing some pictures of really beautiful ones. This one and this one, and these are really beautiful ones that we've studied in the Pacific. Unfortunately, these really beautiful ones aren't local. What we have locally is this one, which is quite beautiful too. This is the sand fiddler, Euca pugulator, and here is Euca pugnax, the mud fiddler, our two most common species here in Long Island. And these also are beneficial to the marsh grass by digging burrows and aerating the sediment. So their burrows are a way of getting oxygen down closer to the roots of the marsh grasses. Some other small invertebrates that play a role include amphipods, like this, isopods, various kinds of worms that help break down the detritus and eat, and some of them are eating the detritus. So they're commonly found in our salt marshes. There are a variety of different snails. The Melampus snail is the one that's the most aerobic. I mean, it's out in the air much more than it's in the water. The periwinkles are in the water and also will climb up the stems of the plants and be out in the air. We have slipper shells also, and the marsh mud snail, all seen in our salt marshes. We have some shrimps. These are grass shrimps and sand shrimp, and we have barnacles. Whenever there's a hard substrate available, you're likely to find some barnacles. And then various crabs. Of course, this horseshoe crab is not really a crab, but it's called a crab. And then of the creel crabs, we have two types of hermit crabs. We have the long-legged and flat-clawed hermit crabs. We have blue crabs. We have mud crabs. We have green crabs. We have marsh crabs. The marsh crab has a relationship with the grass in that it eats it's one of the critters that actually eats the grass when alive, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Resident fishes in the salt marsh. These are fishes living in the tidal creeks, some of whom will come up on top of the marsh during high tide and then back out to the creek when the tide goes out. Most common killifish are mummichug. Here, silver sides, sheep's head minnow here, sticklebacks, winter flounder, and pipefish are all closely associated with salt marshes. We also have other larger species like striped bass, bluefish, white perch coming through, migrating through and eating some of these smaller species of fish. And we have one reptile that is native in salt marshes, the diamondback terrapin. And we have all sorts of birds, and I am only going to show you a few of them because it would take probably, most of the rest of the talk to talk about all the birds that are associated with salt marshes, but we have herring gulls, ospreys, bittern, we have black skimmer, Virginia rail, oyster catcher, we have egrets, cormorants, terns, herons. Most birders like to go to marsh areas to view these birds and others. And then there are some marsh residents we don't love quite so much. And when we run into them, we realize that maybe we're not the top of the food chain after all, and that they may be the top of the food chain. Okay, so this is sort of an overview of the natural history, what organisms are there. The second half of the talk is called an unnatural history, and that looks at what people have done or are doing to salt marshes. And I sort of have it divided up into physical, chemical, and biological changes. Starting with the physical changes, first thing to talk about is ditching. If you look at a marsh and you see the creeks are straight lines, that's not natural. Marsh creeks are not supposed to look like that. Marsh creeks are supposed to look like that. So these were creeks that were dug. And this was done in the earlier part of the 20th century. They ditched these marshes in an attempt for mosquito control. They called them mosquito ditches. The idea here, in theory, was that by making these ditches, the water would go out of the marsh faster, and there would not be able to have pools left on the surface for mosquitoes to breed. Well, it didn't always work that way. It caused lots of vegetation changes and basically lots of changes that were not beneficial, and it didn't seem to be all that effective in controlling mosquitoes. In the past several decades, they've moved to another mosquito control attempt, another approach to mosquito control, which is called open marsh water management, or OMWAM for short. And the idea here is quite the opposite. Let's actually make pools and keep pools on the surface of the marsh. They're using sandbags here. There are various ways of doing that to prevent the water from draining out all the way. Keep the pools, because the killifish will stay here, and the killifish will eat the mosquito larvae. So and it will also attract some birds and stuff to keep the pool. So it's quite the opposite approach. And it isn't 100% effective either. Nothing's going to be 100% effective in mosquito control. But this seems to work better than the ditches. And slowly, very slowly, those ditches begin to fill in and go away. But lots of them are still with us. You can go to many marshes and see these straight ditches. Okay, and then probably the most concerning thing that has been going on over the past century, or more, past several centuries, is filling marshes. In the old days, marshes were not appreciated. They were viewed as, sources of pestilence because of mosquitoes, and useless, and blah, blah, blah. And so here's all this good land. It's too bad. Let's fill it in. We can build houses. We can put our cities on it. And so here's just a look at marsh areas. This is at one time, and this is at some later date, all former marshes filled in for development. And large chunks of New York were built on filled marshes. Most of Queens, 3 airports in the metropolitan region were built on filled salt marshes. They use the word reclaim. Reclamation. That infuriates me, because the word reclaim sort of means take back, right? If you steal something from me, I reclaim it by taking it back. Well, this never was ours. This was the marsh. And to call it reclaiming when you fill it up, pave it over, and build parking lot on top of it is misuse of English language. Anyway, here's just a look at the amount of filling that took in another northeast area in the Boston area. And here you see in black the salt marsh area in 1777. And here you have 1999. Little bitty remnants of the marsh. Here's what Manhattan once looked like. And here is the edge of Manhattan now. What's happened is they filled in the marshes and built, and this is just a view showing the east side of what is there now, and this is the west side from what it was like, you know, when Henry Hudson showed up. So we have built lower Manhattan on marshes. So all over buildings are at marshes. Some current problems, and I will focus on this quite a bit. I consider it physical change, and it's due to climate change, among other things. But not always. The problem of sinking, subsidence, where the marsh is getting lower, sometimes confused with when the water is getting higher, and we have both of these things happening in some places simultaneously. But what has been happening, for example, in Louisiana for a century perhaps, is that there's not enough sediment coming into the marshes in southern Louisiana to keep up. And so the marshes are sinking. They are also extracted oil from underneath. So there are many reasons the marshes are sinking. And the general description of how fast are the marshes in Louisiana sinking is that about a football field worth of marsh per hour. So that's a lot of marsh disappearing in Louisiana. There's a similar problem in Jamaica Bay, in the islands, the marsh islands of Jamaica Bay, bringing back to Long Island. Here you see in red where the marshes used to be, the size of the marsh islands, and in green is the size as of now. So what has happened is that these marshes are sinking, and what you see is a solid marsh turns into something looking like this, you know, clumps. And then as you get more sinking, more of these clumps sink, and it turns into open water. So the end result of this is less marsh and more open water. Now, with Jamaica Bay, the problem is not only that the islands were sinking, but that the sea level was rising as well. In New England, we have an interesting problem where there is a dieback of the plants, of the marsh grasses, and that was turned out to be a result of this critter, which I mentioned before. This is the marsh crab, Sesarma, that eats the Spartina grass. And if you get too many of these, they eat up too much of the Spartina grass. Now, why was there a population explosion of these? Turns out that the natural predators, various species of fish, had been overfished. So there were fewer predators, allowing expansion of the marsh grass population, and then the marsh grass chomps down on too much of the cordgrass, giving you these bare areas. Back to sea level rise. I mean, there's no argument, I think even, I won't mention any names, will agree that sea levels are rising. And the reason that sea level is rising is A, that the water is getting warmer, and two, that the glaciers